So I had mentioned in a few previous Chicago history videos something called the Great Migration, which was basically a huge wave of migration of black folks from the South up to Chicago during like the first 70 years of the 20th century. It was a long process, okay, but it started really all the way in the first decade of the 20th century, but really picked up after World War One. Okay, and World War One dramatically changed the ethnic makeup of Chicago and changed the ethnic and racial dynamics of the city too. So, I've talked in numerous previous videos that in the 1800s and then all the way up into the early 1900s, Chicago was a predominantly European immigrant city. Okay, so the culture of Chicago and the ethnic dynamics of Chicago, most major urban centers in the north of the country were a lot different than the culture in the south and in some of the more rural parts of the country. So back then the ethnic distinctions between quote unquote white people were much more important and much more distinct than they are now. Uh, these groups didn't get along like at all back then, you know what I'm saying? And things that were going on back in Europe, okay, because these were recent like immigrants and first generation people, the politics and the political conflicts back in Europe affected ethnic relations here a lot more than they do today. Okay, and these countries back then were beefing. Okay, you got to remember, it's not like today with the European Union and there's little economic disagreements and stuff like that, and who's going to be in the EU, but they're not at war. You know what I'm saying? Back then, there was full scale wars going on between these European countries, and that really caused a lot of tension and problems here. Okay, so two of the main groups, actually, I'll say three of the main groups that there was big issues with here were Germans, number one, Irish, number two, and Italians, number three. And also, Polish and the rest of them there was a huge pushback, okay, culturally against people from these countries. Now, you look at what's going on today and kind of the pushback against immigration from Latin America. That is nothing, okay? That is nothing compared to the pushback that was going on back then, okay? There was you would openly see ethnic slurs, against these groups in newspapers, and it was normal, you know what I'm saying? They used to deny, explicitly Italians and Irish people jobs with signs no Irish should apply for this job, no Italians here, you know what I'm saying? It was like that, okay? This is much bigger than the stuff going on today with the Mexicans or with the Asians, now there's, stop Asian hate and all that kind of thing. It was way worse back then between the Europeans, okay? The Europeans that initially settled this country mostly were Anglo-Saxons, okay? Descended from the British, okay? So the Irish had a conflict with the British, obviously, because they were trying to gain independence from Britain. There was a big, political conflict in that sense. But one of the main reasons for this conflict, too, that often gets downplayed in history was religion. You look deeper into it, there was a very, profound and good reason for this conflict, okay? When I say good, I don't mean it's a positive thing, but I mean there was a real reason why people differed over this, because it involved two different philosophies about the relation of the individual to the government. Protestantism and Catholicism obviously are two different branches of Christianity, but in Protestantism, the main dynamic is between the individual and his own interpretation of the Bible. Okay, so it's kind of like every person, is deciding for themselves how they want to interpret the Bible and how they want to apply it to their lives, and there's nobody really there to give a definitive declaration about what Christians believe, okay, in Protestant circles. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of like you're there with your Bible and you can decide for yourself what you think it means. Well, in the Catholic Church, okay, and also in the Orthodox Church, in the two older churches, so to speak, there's this idea that Jesus appointed the 12 apostles to safeguard the truth, okay, that he established a ministry with these apostles to basically pass his words down to people and to make sure that they have the correct interpretation of those words so that they don't misinterpret stuff and start applying stuff in ways that it wasn't meant to be applied. These older churches believe that the apostles, when they died, passed this ministry on to others. They appointed successors. And that those men, when they died, appointed other successors, and that there's an unbroken line of succession from the apostles down to the bishops okay, of the present day. And so when there's a question about a new law, or whenever somebody comes along and brings up some question about, Christian teaching or something like that, the bishops, okay, who are Catholics and Orthodox, believe the successors of the apostles, can meet and say, this is what, the correct interpretation of this scripture is, and this is how we're going to apply this scripture to our dealing with this law or whatever the government has told us to do, so that there's one agreed upon idea, okay, in that church. So the reason why this was a threat to the American government is that this is a higher authority, okay, than a higher visible authority than the president, right, or than the Congress. Okay, if the president or the Congress say, like, I'll give a real example of how this can come into play. If the laws of the United States say that, when a woman comes to a pharmacy and tries to get the abortion pill, okay, the pharmacist must give it to her. Okay, let's say that there's a law that, we're just talking hypothetically here. Let's say there's a law that, says that he must provide that for her. If the bishops meet, okay, and say, listen, we're Catholics, even though abortion isn't specifically in the Bible, this is how we interpret it. This is how all of us are going to interpret it. And so if you're a Catholic pharmacist and some woman comes to you for the abortion pill, you are bound to deny her that. You can't go along with it. We're not going to participate in this. It's immoral, and therefore you must refuse her. Okay? So you got a conflict here between the church and the government. Okay? The government, okay, the church in numerous instances has told Catholics to disobey the government. Okay? What the government is telling us to do is evil, so we're not going to do it. A Catholic person, a devout Catholic, would have to obey that, okay, and disobey the government. And this actually happens. This actually comes up. And, so, the Catholics were seen as a big threat because of that. And this was brought up even in the campaign of John F. Kennedy. Like, is he going to have more allegiance to the church than he has to the Constitution of the United States? And for a devout Catholic, the answer to that would be yes, okay, or an Orthodox Christian too. You would have to give more allegiance to that. But on top of that, there was also the political conflicts, and so there was a ton of anti-Irish, anti-Italian, anti-Polish sentiment here, okay, and they were seen as kind of like dirty outsiders, that we can't really trust, what I'm saying, because they might not go along with us and stick with their church, okay, or with their ethnic group. So in a lot of instances, this actually happened. Anti-Catholic sentiment, especially from the KKK. The KKK was very anti-Catholic. They were trying to keep America Protestant. It caused even more pushback from the Irish. The Irish, they actually lynched a KKK member in effigy. I think when one of them was coming here trying to do a speech or something like that, they were just totally against them. But the war caused tensions to come to really a head. So the city's German and Irish communities, they, in general, were kind of taking the side of the Germans, who at that time were clicked up with Austria-Hungary, Turkey, and Bulgaria. Okay, and some of them were kind of like, let's just stay out of it. America should just stay neutral. But some of them were taking the other power side. Now, you got to remember, this is World War I, not World War II. So we're not talking about like a racist war here. The Germans weren't trying to exterminate anybody during World War I. Hitler hadn't come to power yet. This was before all that. But the United States government was, taking the side of the other team, basically, Great Britain, France, and Russia. Okay, and the Germans that were here, they were not happy about that one bit. Okay, so some German Americans who were more famous, and some examples of this, Oscar Mayer, okay, who you now know for the guy who, had that meat company. A guy named Charles Wacker, and a guy who was the head of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. His name was Frederick Stock. And then you had some of the Irish that were like on the side of the Germans. They were coming out really strongly against the American alliance with those powers. But the German Americans, they couldn't succeed in this. Okay, the United States did not stay neutral. Part of this happened because there were German attacks on American shipping. Okay, and there was also something that happened between Germany and Mexico. The Germans went to the Mexicans and they told the Mexicans that if you side with us, if you click up with us, and we win, we will give you guys back the territory that you lost to the Americans in the Southwest. Okay, so when it came out that the Germans had made this offer to the Mexicans, this kind of like was like the last straw. You know, we're going against Germany now, and anybody who was on the side of the Germans now was like an op. Okay, so once the United States actually started fighting in World War One, okay, actually got on the battlefield and started fighting, Germans who were here in the United States, okay, got a huge backlash. Okay, there was a huge anti-German push. You know, they were calling them the Huns and stuff like that. So they started actually like taking out German names from everywhere in American culture. Okay, stuff like, for example, Frankfurters, they were renamed hot dogs. Sauerkraut, it got renamed Liberty Cabbage. A lot of the German institutions here were renamed with more American names. The Germans were kind of trying to duck and hide the ones that were over here. And there were certain institutions which were not even governmental institutions. One of them, for example, was the American Protective League. They were kind of spying on Chicago's German population. So here in Chicago, it affected politics because the mayor, who at that time was a guy named William Thompson, tried to get the support of Chicago's German and Irish voters, basically by running on a platform of America staying out of the war. So he was kind of going against what was going on with the federal government. Okay, Chicago's mayor kind of came at odds with them. But the future mayor of Chicago, a guy named Anton Cermak, he at that time was in a race for the Cook County sheriff. He was coming out strongly against the Germans, okay, in his campaigning, but he was running in a county that had a heavily German population, and so he actually lost that race. He got defeated. But as far as how World War I affected or primed the city, I'll say, for the Great Migration, that the war almost completely stopped immigration from Europe. People who were born here, the Chicagoans that were born here, they were, going to fight, or they were, going to help out with the war in some way. And so the employers here, they had to come up with a new source of labor. And so what they did was they turned to women and to black people, okay? And they started hiring these black people in jobs that used to be filled by European immigrants or native-born white males. So this opened up, a whole new world of opportunity for black folks here, okay? Because now all the whites are over there fighting, or the whites are over, somewhere helping out. So now all the factory jobs here are open, okay? And this was huge. So, if you're a black person in the South, you hear through the grapevine, hey, the whites are all over in Europe fighting. There's work up there, money up there to make, okay? Are we going to hang around here in the South? Slavery's only been over for a few decades. Who knows if it's going to come back? Like, why are we hanging around here? Let's dip. I mean, that's what be going through my mind, right? Are you going to just hang around and wait to see what's going to happen here? It's like, you got to remember, this is back in the day. We didn't have the benefit of hindsight that we have today. I mean, back then, they didn't know things were going to end up where they're at now. You know what I'm saying? Like, anything could have happened back then. So slavery had always been illegal in the North, okay, but it had, you're still stuck in the South with some guys who used to own slaves, and these people were still alive at that time. So it's a whole different ballgame back then. So a lot of black folks from the South, they just took off, okay, and they came here to work in factories, which was obviously a very different type of work than they had back there. And the ethnic dynamics of the city up here were very different from the ones down there. The type of whites they were dealing with up here were very different than the whites they were dealing with back there. Okay, the Irish, the Italians, that was a whole different set of rules, okay, a whole different culture than the Anglo-Saxons in the South. And the Irish and the Italians up here, and the Polish and the Ukrainians and all them, they had something going on up here that they didn't have going on down there in the South, and that was the streets. Okay, they get up here and they find that all these Europeans up here are on that. Everybody's got their own neighborhood, everybody's, got their own block, and you cross that borderline and it's going to be that. So this was, something they were already doing amongst themselves. So now black folks come up here, they're on that with them too. They come into their neighborhood not thinking anything is unusual about doing this. Like, oh, I'm just going over to this block, going to this store, going to get something to eat. Okay, well, what's going to happen now? You're in this guy's neighborhood. I didn't even know he felt that way about his neighborhood. Now him and his homies are all getting down on me. We're going to get into that in the next video. You guys are going to see the first year after World War I was over and all these Europeans were coming back. Okay, there was a race riot here in Chicago, a race war, which I'll say was probably like the third or fourth biggest race war that we've had in the history of the city. Took place in 1919. I'm going to cover that in the next video. That took place, immediately after World War One. Okay, and it took place between the Irish on the south side and the black folks on the south side. Those were the two groups. And it wasn't a citywide conflict with whites. It was just mainly the Irish. And the Irish at one point actually tried to get the Italians to come in on their side with them, but it didn't work. But it was just those two groups, man. And this was, I'm calling it like the third or fourth biggest race war, because the biggest, you're going to see like 3 or 4 videos in the future, really happened during Prohibition between the Irish and the Italians. That was like, and I know that technically that's not a race war, it's like an ethnic war, but as far as ethnic conflicts, that one was the biggest. Okay, I mean, you're talking so many lives over years that war took place, and it was just crazy. But that's in the future in upcoming videos, man. Stay tuned for the next episode of Chicago History. But this was how the Great Migration started. All those factory jobs opening up because of World War I. This is your boy Winnie C. Report. I'm out.